nicely. And now I'd like to invite our panel of speakers to come up, Patrick Whorton and Melissa Bush and Karl Hurst-Wicker. And I want to thank them in advance for being part of this. And instead of having them speak individually, what I wanted to do was have them speak in conversation with each other about the topic of hospitality. And so we've created these 3 generative questions, and they are: what does hospitality mean to you? What is radical about hospitality? And in what ways can we at VUU push ourselves toward a radical hospitality?
Good morning. I'm Melissa, and I appreciate you being here. And I was going to wear something fancier, but I wore my shirt that says, "We are here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness," which is one of my favorite Thich Nhat Hanh quotes. He's a Buddhist monk, if you're not familiar with him. So I will start our little timer. So I'm going to start with the first question, which is, what does hospitality mean to you? And if I can start, because I went to the dictionary, which is where I start most things like this, Merriam-Webster, because in my house I had an unabridged dictionary on a stand in the living room, and when my dad would use a word that I didn't understand, he would drive me to the dictionary. Like, "You're being obstreperous." And I was like, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Go look it up." So I looked up hospitality. I didn't look up obstreperous because I already know what that means. So I looked it up, and according to Merriam-Webster, it was first used in the 14th century, and it means friendly and generous treatment of guests. So when I think of generosity, apart from financial generosity, I think of being open-hearted. I think of how that takes some vulnerability. And I also think about listening. And to me, there's the deep and active listening that's so important for all of us. And one reason I like to participate in the Welcome Circle at VUU is to listen to people who come, and I want to hear their stories. And I heard somebody say, listen to people's stories and make it matter. And I think that that speaks to hospitality. So I won't dominate this. You guys chime in.
I often think of opposites when I think of defining something. So I think of inhospitable people or inhospitable behavior. And actually I am an optimist, and I think a fairly kind and hospitable person. But I think that hospitality, when I try to define it, I think of words like kindness and generosity. But what I think hospitality often does is that it calls into question our honesty and sincerity, because without those 2 components, I'm not really sure we can be hospitable. I'll give you an example of this. I would ask you to think about someone you're naturally inhospitable to, and I had a dealing with a utility company this week, and here's an example where you're usually always talking to a stranger, whether it's at the utility company or the bank or the credit card, or I'm using an example of a issue or complaint that we're trying to deal with here. And so when I define hospitality for myself, and I think of these words, the word kindness, and how difficult that can be in dealing with an adversarial situation. That's how I define hospitality, is how I can check my own inhospitable behavior, if you will, in those trying adversarial situations.
So when I think about it, I kind of go back to my youth and my childhood, and I noticed over our shoulder at one point there was a slide that said I was a stranger and you welcomed me, and I was thinking about hospitality, and that is from the book of Matthew, and that was kind of like the preeminent sort of way our household was. There were always strangers in our house. My grandparents were just very welcoming and loved having people over, would easily offer them, food and drink and good conversation. And regardless of their, whoever was visiting's walk of life, what they believed or whatever, enjoyed speaking with them and learning more about them. And so that's how I view it, is sort of being open and welcoming to meeting new people with different walks of life. And
do you do that in your own house now?
we try, yeah. And so, we just had friends over last night, and we don't all necessarily believe the same thing or whatever else, but it's fun to be together and to talk about our different beliefs and everything, and also play Cards Against Humanity, which is always a good way to learn a lot about the people you're hanging out with.
That's a good test of hospitality.
I think that was, growing up, it was just such a common thing in our household. For years, my sister and I, my sister Val, there was an older, white lady who would come to our family Thanksgiving, and we just thought it was like our great-grandmother's neighbor. We called her Aunt Vi, and we're just like, oh, it's our great-grandmother's neighbor, and, she must not have any family. No, she was our actual aunt. Like, she was our great-grandfather's sister. But we were just so used to having people come to family events that we, they don't have anybody. They don't, they don't have their own family here. They're strangers here or whatever. Have them come over. Open the house. Give them food and a place to be with people, to enjoy feeling as if they're a part of our family. I think that's a big part of hospitality, about making people feel as if they're part of your family. We don't agree with every member of our family, but we try and extend that love to them regardless of what they feel and our differences. And that's how I view hospitality.
So my parents got kicked out of the Methodist Church. Some of you heard my story, and I won't go into it now, but I'll tell you sometime. But one of the things that they wanted to do in the 50s was to work in social justice causes in the community, because they felt that the church wasn't doing enough of it. So they formed a house church, and they bought a house in the inner city in Rochester, New York, and paid the lion's share of the mortgage, and had 2 single moms consecutively live in the house and raise their kids. And they did that for several years, and then eventually sold the house. But so I always think of that as like a really fine example of living out your truth and being radical in hospitality. Do you want to say more?
I'm going to just kind of bounce on what you said here about doing something radical. I do believe that hospitality is easy with people that we agree with, but it's not so easy with people with whom we have disagreements. We are, let me see how I can be sensitive or insensitive about this. We're living in a divisive culture. I don't think that's shocking to anybody right now who watched the news this morning. And I often think, as kind of a news junkie, how much more we could accomplish when I'm watching people just trying to outdo one another on the opposite of hospitality. It's hard to not, I think, be cliche here, but I have found, and it's difficult for me because it doesn't come to me naturally. I want to be adversarial. I think it's my personality. But it is true that you can get much more with a smile because I've been experimenting with it. And
and you have such a nice
thank you so
smile.
much. And I've been using Crest white strips. And no, honestly, that's the real challenge, I think, to hospitality is the opposite. I can't get off the opposite.
So maybe that's the radical part, which leads us to
Yeah.
our next question.
Yeah, the next question is, what is radical about hospitality? And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking the same thing, is that it's easy to bring people who believe that, that we
Right.
do everything, but opening up our hearts and truly listening to someone who doesn't feel as we feel or believe as we believe, and trying to find some common ground is really the radical part. That's what's hard. This morning I was reading ESPN, and the Green Beret who had met with Colin. When Colin Kaepernick started his protest, he started just by sitting on the bench. And he started kneeling later. And that actually came out of a meeting he had with the Green Beret, who wrote an open letter that got published in a paper somewhere, and basically said, he didn't agree with what he was doing. And Kaepernick turned around and said, hey, let's meet and talk. And just, it sort of opened, to be hospitable to this guy who didn't agree with him. And the two of them came, and he let the Green Beret talk about his feelings about it, and then Kaepernick talked about his feelings. And they came up with the idea to kneel. The whole idea being that when you have a fallen soldier, at the funeral, after they fold the flag into the triangle, an officer kneels and presents that flag to their wife or their loved ones, and so they came out of it, and that's where the kneeling part came.
And that got lost in the discussion.
And that got lost in everything. And I thought it was interesting. He wrote another open letter that got published on ESPN, and he was saying what's truly disheartening is not just that the message has gotten lost on both sides, but that he's as a soldier, he's like, it is very disheartening to go abroad, watch your buddies get killed, be treated with more hospitality by the people whose country you're in than when you get home, and you come home and you find that you've just gotten to a point where everyone's very inhospitable, and just wants to win for the sake of winning, and that's a really sad thing. I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the differences and then retreat to your own camp, right? And Barbara had sent. I was talking about Audre Lorde in one of the emails she sent us, and I was looking up. It was the quote she mentioned was the master's keys will not open master's house, and so I found that speech of Audre Lorde's, and she mentions that if we're going to have a society, we have to embrace each other's differences, and we have to have those debates. We can't just say, well, we're going to let all our differences go by the wayside, and you have to have those tough conversations, and that truly requires hospitality. It truly requires being radical enough to say, I'm going to listen to what you have to say and try and find some common ground there, or at least try and understand where you're coming from and why you believe that. And I think that's the tough part. That's what's radical.
Yeah, and I think that takes love, and to love one another and our differences as well as our similarities. And so when I was thinking about radical, I actually went to the dictionary. And let's see, so the three definitions they gave, I was only really thinking about the third definition, which is extreme. Because of everything that's going on in the world, that's kind of how I think when I think radical. But the first definition was of or relating to or preceding from a root, like mathematics. And Leonard said, well, yeah, like mathematics. And I thought, oh, yeah, I had sort of forgotten about that. And then the second one was of or relating to the origin or fundamental. And so then I got thinking about core values. So what are my core values? How do I live out those core values? Is that a radical way to approach things if I can embrace more of that I'm not, that I may need to sort of think harder about that?
I'll pick up on that about trying to be true to our own value system. And I think we all have a similar value system in here. We're all Unitarians. We're all sitting in a UU congregation this morning. I think what I'm hearing from you guys is the real test of hospitality is leaving our comfort zones. And
I wrote that. You looked at my notes.
I did not. I am not cheating. I made that up myself.
I said, it offers me an opportunity to step out of my comfort zone.
Yeah. See, we're all Unitarians up here. I do think that's what's called for, though, it to be serious, and it's so difficult to do. I just spent 2 weeks in Denver, where my partner and I are getting ready to move up there next summer, and we've got a million things going, and I'm trying to meet people and network up there. And I have actually dug up relatives that I have that I've never met. And I managed
not literally
to... Yeah,
digging them up.
Yeah, no, not dead. And... and I met up with a second cousin, and we went out to dinner. And I'd never met this man's 28 years old, and I'd never met him. And it was kind of weird because his mother and I are just 3 years apart, and she had a child, and we were close growing up, and I'd never met this guy. And so we went out to dinner, and after a couple of cocktails, the conversation turned to politics, of course, as it often does. And we found ourselves in an interesting discussion about family and politics and why people don't speak to each other. And a lot of it was politics. So I think, I was willing to step out of my comfort zone and say things in a nice way, smiling, that I might not normally have said to a stranger because I didn't know this young man. And what I found was if you approach people with kindness and sincerity, and I'm going to use another word here that I think falls into this discussion, is in a non-judgmental manner, which is really hard to do, then you can have results. What I found out was that my politics and this young millennial's politics were pretty much the same, but his parents were not. And so I found out through speaking to him how I might approach people. Unless you talk, guys, about the differences, I don't think we're ever going to come to the sameness. And that is so hard to do. And I believe that this this element of hospitality is not detrimental, is a necessary element in coming to that middle ground.
Right, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. You talked a little bit about that.
Right.
So I was thinking about that too, that we have to be open and vulnerable and willing to go there, and that's a hard thing when we can sense that people are think differently, so differently from ourselves. So, and then offering forgiveness when it goes against my natural inclinations, I also think that that's kind of radical. So if there's places in my life where I need to offer some forgiveness, even though it feels like I don't want to, I think that's radical.
Definitely.
So
Are we?
we're
Okay, so
33 seconds from
okay.
question 3.
Okay, 33 seconds from question 3. Question 3, in what ways can we at VUU push ourselves toward radical hospitality?
Do you want to go first? Okay. So I have, actually brought this book. I'm not going to, I'll just mention it. It's called The Moth Presents All These Wonders, True Stories About Facing the Unknown. And if you don't know about the Moth Radio Hour, it's on NPR. I think it's on Saturdays at 3 in the afternoon. Another 10 minutes we get. Okay, here we go. We get 30 minutes, she said. Anyway.
I think she's implying we have big mouths
okay. Well,
up
anyway.
here.
So I just want to mention this. I just give me a few minutes, okay? So I had Grant Boyd. Some of you know Grant. He's a longtime member of VUU, and he wondered aloud a few years ago at a gathering here about this question. He said, since we UUs are accepting of so much of who we are as humans, like the spectrum of LGBTQ persons or immigrants, refugees, Muslims, fill in the whatever name you want. He said, more so than other either traditions or the general American culture, where do we go from there? Where is our edge? How do we push beyond that? And I've thought about that so many times over the last few years, and it's really been a really good kind of way to think about things. And so I found this story in The Moth, and it's basically the story of Hector Black, whose daughter Patricia was murdered by a man named Ivan Simpson when he was looking for drugs and broke into Patricia's apartment. And so Hector talks about this experience, and Hector says, my first instinct had been that he was a monster. He was no human being. He deserved no compassion from me. But then I learned about where he came from and how he grew up. A life of abuse at the hands of his mother and other terrible circumstances, his sister drowned by his mother in front of him. I couldn't help thinking, here we are, the richest country in the world, the most powerful, and there was no one for this little boy. It wasn't that I was trying to excuse what he had done, but I felt for him as another human being suffering. Speaks to empathy, compassion. Hector went to the man's sentencing hearing and said to the judge, we put this on Patricia's headstone. All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of a single candle. Hector continued to the judge, love is that candle. Love does not seek another death. Love brings life and healing and wholeness. At the end of the sentencing hearing, Hector said, I don't hate you, Ivan Simpson, but I hate with all my soul what you did to my daughter. And he says, tears were streaming down Ivan's cheeks, and I'll never forget that look, like a soul in hell. Ivan said, I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused. Hector said, I could have said, you murdered my daughter and you're sorry, big deal. But I couldn't. He was a man off the street. He had nothing. But he had given me the only thing he had. He had nothing but his apology. With those words, he had asked me to forgive him. Hector knew he had to forgive Ivan, saying, a friend of mine told me that when you hate, you take poison and you expect the other person to die. And I think that's true. Revenge and anger hold you in the past. Forgiveness can free you to go into the future. So then Hector started writing to Ivan in prison, sent him a Christmas package, and said, when you forgive someone, you start to care about them. And I knew he had no one in the world. After a time, he visited Ivan in prison. They talked for a couple hours, and standing up to leave, they hugged each other. Hector said, it was an unbelievable moment that I could have my arms around the man who murdered my daughter. Hector concluded, I think forgiveness is possible, even for the worst among us, and I do believe we all need forgiveness, God knows. And so back to Grant, who said simply, either we believe in redemption or we don't. So that's all I got to say about that.
I feel that's a great place. There's nothing I can add to that. That's a great place to end, I think. Patrick, do you have anything? Or?
Of course I do.
He's a teacher. He's a teacher. He gets the last word.
In coming into this today and being asked to sit up here and talk about hospitality, the one principle that came to mind of the 7 principles was social justice. And I think what we all can do, and maybe this means stepping out of your comfort zone, is that we can all work for the greater good. And I'm not a big social media guy, and but I'm on. And one of the things that sort of bothers me, and I'll just use Facebook as an example, is it's easy to post the daily quote, and I look at them. I mean, I prefer the Dalai Lama, but there's a lot of them. And it's easy to look at that and say, isn't that a nice idea? Let's all be kind to one another. But it's not the posting of the quote, and I'm so tired of this, that's doing anything. So we all have to get up off our butts and actually do something. I think everybody in here probably votes, and that's the first thing that we can all do. But in terms of social justice, we have to do something. And I think when we think about hospitality, I think about what we are doing as a congregation, as a group, as a faith, to what are we doing for the greater good? And I don't think posting the daily inspirational quote of the day is enough. We have to get on our feet and be hospitable.
I think, are we done? Did you want to say any more? No? I think that's good. Thanks. Thanks, Professor.